Good morning, everyone. Hi. Okay, morning. Cool. My name's Richard Miller. I work at SymfonyLive in the UK. I do quite a lot of training, consulting, and auditing of other people's applications as well. So today, kind of want to look at just some of the sort of common things that we find and how we're looking to sort of move towards sort of finding solutions for a lot of these sort of common problems our customers have in applications. So everyone kind of wants to build robust applications that are resilient to change, but we quite often find that sort of over time as these applications get more complex, that people sort of get to a point where they struggle to make changes and they have knock-on effects elsewhere. And you know, particularly good people have lots of test coverage and all this, but all the tests do is kind of identify that you need to make changes everywhere and make sure that the bugs don't appear because of those changes, rather than sort of allowing you to kind of make them in a couple of places. So, and the applications I'm talking about are not those where, I mean, we do see some that contain some sort of particularly horrible code or bad things happening, bad practices, but it's usually those where people have, you know, they've read all the documentation, they've looked at the blogs and things about that, they've sort of come to us for training and things, and they want to follow all these best practices, but they're still kind of getting bogged down in some of the detail in the model in particular. Symfony's great at providing us with this sort of framework. It makes making web applications easy, but it makes it's great because it allows us the freedom to kind of model the application, the domain, how we want, but we don't particularly give any guidance on how to do that, and this is sort of where a lot of the questions come from, and where a lot of the sort of fragility in these applications we find comes from. So, a lot of this applies to others, but for the sake of argument, because they're the most common things we see, kind of thinking about those that we're using Doctrine with entities, repositories, all this. We've got entities, public getters and setters, we map them to forms, pass the entities straight through to our templates, and you know, as you'll see, kind of reading through the documentation, that's sort of seemingly the standard way of doing things. So for me, I think one of the two kind of things I think we're doing in these sort of applications that makes them fragile and difficult to change are violations of some of the solid principles. So the first two in particular, so the single responsibility principle, so we're making things within applications responsible for too many things, and there's too many reasons to change things. This is why we end up with this problem changing applications further down the line as they grow more complex. And the dependency and version principle, where we're making sure that high-level modules, so as well as classes, we're talking about full sort of components of our applications are dependent on others, and instead of both being dependent on abstractions. This is not just about using dependency injection, but about making sure that we're not coupling everything together tightly. Cool, so one of the common questions I get asked during training, consultants and the like, is should everything go in a bundle? So should all the application code go into bundles? No, in my opinion. So for the examples in here, I'm going to look at a human resources bundle. It doesn't really matter, but it's just the idea that we're modelling human resources action. So particularly at first, we're going to be looking at absence requests. So people who want an application, their staff members can say, I want to book holiday in 2 weeks' time, or I need some unpaid leave for a month in 2 months' time, etc. So we might start by just putting everything in our human resources bundle. So controllers, forms, views, and entities and repositories, but we're really making this human resources bundle responsible for too many things. So instead of that single bundle, we can split it perhaps into human resources bundle and a sort of standalone library for the kind of domain code. So the bundle has for the controllers the templates, the forms that are related to web application. They're in the kind of application domain, and our human resources can contain the entities, things that relate to human resources, staff members, leave requests, approvers, etc. And line managers, the like. Okay, and we want to kind of make sure there's no dependencies from the domain language through to the bundle, because if we want to make everything in the sort of domain model speak the language of the domain, the language of human resources, then it shouldn't know about forms and controllers, etc. And also if we do this, we can find that human resources model is no longer tied to the framework, and we can use it in other applications. If we want to expose it as a console application, probably wouldn't in this case, but and also it leaves future migrations. So if you need to migrate it to another framework or Symfony 3 in the future, then that will be made easier to take that domain model. Because when we change framework, we're not changing the sort of domain of human resources. There's no change in human resources. So if we need to change the human resources bundle in order to, as the human resources domain model, because of application changes, and we're breaking that dependency, breaking SRP, because we're making changes to the domain for non-domain related changes. Okay, so it's a step in the right direction, it's getting a bit better, but it's still tightly coupled, and we've not really got the break between the dependencies between them. So we've just moved entities and repositories in there, we're still going to be relying on the entities pretty heavily, tying them straight back in that bundle. And one of the common places we're end up doing this in forms. So most applications are not really CRUD applications once you sort of start to think of things in terms of the actions in the domain. So with absence leaves, if someone does not create an absence, they request that they're going to have absence, and someone else might approve the absence. They might cancel the absence rather than deleting it, and we might want to change the absence type. So we're not saying I need to update it, but I want to change it from unpaid leave to something to paid leave. And if we end up with different form types for all of these things, because we're capturing different information, we're capturing something different for requesting an absence from cancelling an absence, and we're cancelling the absence, we're not going to provide dates and things, we're just going to provide maybe a reason for cancelling the absence. So we end up mapping it to all these different form types. So the entities coupled directly to these forms, which now means if we change properties in the entity, because our understanding of how the Human Resources Department thinks of these leave requests, then you're going to have to change all of those form types. So, which is going to maybe cause us some issues or prevent us from changing the entity, because there'll be too much hassle to change all the forms. And we may also end up with complex validation groups, because we've got different form types asking for different information. When we ask to cancel and we want to provide a reason, then we need to validate that the reason was within the character limit, say. But we don't want to be doing that when we're first registering an absence, so we end up introducing a sort of complexity and validation groups. And as the sort of complexity grows, we might end up using form events as well. So I think the problem here is that what we're doing is we're making the entity responsible for validating user input. So we're asking it to validate things like the number of characters, which is not a concern of the human resources domain. It's a concern of the application. This is a framework thing. It's a UI concern. So And we might also find that we have changes going the other way. So we want to make UX changes where we change what fields the end users input, and then that leads us to changing our entity. But the entity shouldn't be changing if the UX changes, because the entity, we're having to add extra properties from extra field we're doing, but it's not something that ends up in the eventual domain. So what we can do is, as a first step, I think, is to separate the responsibility for capturing that user input into extra classes that sit in between. So we're going to have a request absence command, that just contains properties for the things required for requesting an absence. And then maybe for cancelling the absence, we can have a command that just captures the reason and nothing else. So then we don't need those validation groups anymore, because there is no reason property on the request absence command, and that's the only property maybe on the cancel absence command, so we can do away with some of that technical complexity and start to expose that the real complexity here lies in the domain, by saying that all we ever do is create, update, delete entities, and we're actually hiding the complexity around dealing with requesting these absences. By using these commands, we kind of make that explicit. These are the different things that we're doing, but we also simplify some of the technical complexity, because we do away with those validation loops and perhaps form events and the like. So we have simple validation, and the command name captures the domain actually. So I'll call them command objects because it's a pattern. It means that the method, the thing that we're doing, the action we're taking out, is in the name of the object, and its properties contain the data that we need in order to carry out that command. But it does mean we have more classes, which seems to be an objection. It looks more complex on the diagram. But they're simpler classes, so as I think Anthony was saying, complexity is a problem in these sort of things where all the complexity is kind of dropped into one thing. If we try and keep a small number of classes and methods, we're quite often introducing complexity and removing it with simpler classes and methods, not increasing it. And the other objection we sort of find saying is it's introducing repetition, because there's probably going to be some repeated properties between those command objects. But in this case, like I said, just don't worry about it, because this sort of repetition in properties and things, we see quite often how many of our entities have IDs and names and things like this, but we don't worry too much about extracting that somewhere else. So in this case, it's like each of our commands is doing different things, so repetition of properties shouldn't be a huge concern. Okay, so what we're doing is trying to reduce the technical complexity and because as developers, I think we like to have technical solutions to things where really it's domain complexity, and it'd be better to make that explicit and reduce the technical complexity as much as we like solving technical problems. Okay, so what else are we what other couplings are that we can kind of look at reducing? So one of them, again, that we see is that, and again, it's how it shows it in the documentation things, is passing entities straight through to templates and then accessing the properties on these. So, yeah, we might be displaying our absences in lots of different ways. So, the upcoming ones with details of them, we might want to make a fancy calendar view. Staff, the HR manager might want to see which ones weren't approved and for what reason. But we quite often end up seeing this in things as really causing a pain sort of point for people, in that you pass your entity straight into these, but then when we want to change the properties in the entity to reflect something else, you've got to go into all of these templates and track down every instance of it, because the property name's changed, so the getter will be using the template to access it. So it's changed. And another thing we see is trying to encourage people to avoid putting lots of logic in templates. So in this case, when we're displaying the details of the entity, we might want to say if the end date has already passed, and we show it in the past. Otherwise, we show the status, we show if it's pending, we show if it's been approved. So this is only a really small little bit of logic, but if we keep it in templates when it's difficult to test, if it's in the PHP method, it could be tested. And it's pretty simple, so you might think, why worry about testing this? But I know personally I can still manage to make a mess of things like this, so I like to make sure it's tested, because I can, I don't know, put greater than when I meant less than quite easily. Okay. So if we want to test it, what can we do? We can move it into the entity, simplify the template, which is nice, so nice clean templates. If we want to reuse this elsewhere, it's wrapped up in a method, we're not repeating ourselves in the templates. And we add a display status method to the absence entity. But again, we're kind of coupling this back into our entity. So for one thing, we might want to display the status differently on different views, and then end up introducing yet more methods into it. And also, it's presentational logic. This is not business logic, so it shouldn't be the responsibility of something in the domain. If we want to reuse these entities in a different application later, it shouldn't have the presentational logic of our initial web application in it. And if we want to expose it, say, as a REST API, because we're going to make a mobile app for it, then it shouldn't care about the presentational logic of the web application. So again, we can solve this in pretty much the same way, get more classes, by introducing maybe a single sort of view class that sits in between, that we pass into our templates. And we'll need to translate the sort of data from the absence entity into the view, so it can get passed through to the form. But it does mean that if we change the properties in the absence entity, we might sort of realise that we want to split it into different, sort of pull out some classes inside to capture some of the information better, or model it in a better way. We can now use our view sort of object to map those changes through to the form, so we don't need to kind of make the form so tightly coupled to the entity and so fragile to changes in the entity. The view can kind of act as an intermediary point of this. And it can also hold that presentational logic, so we no longer need to keep it in templates, we also no longer need to keep it in the domain, we can just move it into these absence views, the absence view in this case. And we may have multiple ones, because we might find that we need to have different versions of our status method, or different versions that provide data in slightly different ways to the different templates. So it may not be a single object, it might be that we need several of those. Okay, so once we make the commands that are now responsible for capturing data for an action, and the views are responsible for providing data for presentation to templates. So, I guess what is our entity now responsible for? Because if it's just those getters and setters, and we're not really using them in forms anymore, because the command objects have got those, and we're not using them in templates anymore, then kind of what does it do? So, if we look at what might be happening in the controller, then we can sort of see something that perhaps the controller is being made responsible for, and the entity should be responsible for instead. So, let's say we're cancelling the request. The only thing that was in the command, the only thing we asked the user for was a reason for cancelling the request. And yet, when we update the entity, we're not going to just give the reason. We also need to set the status for cancelled. We may also want to record the cancellation date. So if you have a controller that sort of takes the form, validates it, yeah, they gave a reason, it's not too long, and then updates the entity and then saves it back to the database, then the controller is responsible for the internal state of the entity. It's responsible for making sure that the entity is consistent. And that's not really a job for a controller. You might want to pull this out and say, well, I don't like doing that much work in my controller anyway, I'm going to make a service for it. But even so, that service shouldn't really be responsible for this. And anywhere that you want to cancel it, you're making that responsibility appear there as well. So, instead of making a controller responsible for this state, we can make the entity responsible for it. So, if we just get rid of those sort of setters and have a cancel method on the entity, then all the controller needs to do is pass it that reason inside that cancel method. We can set the status, the reason, set the date, but nothing outside the entity really needs to know that's what it's doing. And we can change that now. We no longer say it's no longer like, well, if we want to change it so that we record the status in a slightly different way, or we don't want the date anymore, then you can just do that in one place in the entity and it just has no knock-on effect elsewhere, whereas previously we needed to kind of find it in the controller. And we also gain some sort of readability, so if we're in the controller, we see it calling the entity's cancel method, then it's really explicit that that's what's happening. We're cancelling the entity. Whereas before, you could work that out because we're setting the state to cancel and things like this, but you don't even need to look at the code in the absence entity if you're reading the controller now to know what's happening in one simple line. So the entity now has this responsibility for protecting its state and just exposing kind of behaviours instead. It's just going to tell us what you can do with it, not here's all my properties, just make sure you leave them in a consistent state. And we separate as well two other responsibilities that we tend to conflate in applications, and that leads again to these sort of complexities of things like sort of validation groups and things like this. Is that there's two things we're doing. So one is that the entity is now validating its internal consistency, because that cancel method can make sure that if you set cancellation reason, it's never going to be the case that the status isn't set to cancelled. Whereas before, that could quite easily have been the case. We could have set a reason and forgotten to update the state. So the absence entity is validating its internal consistency. We don't need to kind of add validators that say, if the reason field is set and the cancellation date field is not set, then that's when we have a validation error. The cancel method can take care of this for us. And the cancel absence command now has the responsibility for validating user input, which is a different concern. And what we're doing here is just helping the user out, saying, hey, you didn't fill this field. And it's not about internal consistency, it's a kind of a UI concern. Okay, so going back to this sort of view of it, the controller, though, I guess, so this is all great and a step toward in the right direction. Well, really, find helpful move because we're now making the domain explicit, reducing some of the fragility. But a further step might be to look at the way the controller is still pretty dependent on the absence entity. If we're getting it from a repository, calling that cancel method on it, then we've got quite a lot of dependency there between those. So what we might want to do is consider introducing another class that deals with that side of things, so the controller can just hand off the command if it validates correctly to something that handles that command and then updates the entity. And we might even move to more of a thing where we kind of have a service that we sort of throw the command at and it works out which command handler. So then we make sort of decouple the controllers from what it really does. So the controller then just has the job of validating form and throwing the command off to somewhere else to deal with it. Okay, so another thing that we quite often sort of find, and can be a problem, is this sort of tightly coupling new sort of choice of infrastructure in. So again, if you're using Doctrine, you've got that kind of well-we-can-move database, but you're still, by putting Doctrine repositories as part of the model, you're kind of really tying yourself into A, using Doctrine, and B, the domain caring about these sort of database concerns. And persistence isn't a domain responsibility. If you talk to the HR manager, they're not going to talk about databases and things like this. Well, they might, but I hope they don't. They're just going to be talking about staff members, approvers, requests, not, oh, and then we need to save it to the database. They just need to know that it just needs to appear to be persistent in some way. But the repository is part of the domain. Like, we have collections of staff members. We want to have, the HR manager may well say, I want to be able to view the staff with upcoming leave in the next month so that we can sort of plan and schedule for that. But we can deal with this by relying on abstractions. So going back to the dependency and version principle, if we rely on abstractions and not on implementations, then we can deal with this. We can make an interface for our repository. So we're introducing yet more things, but we make an absences interface in the domain because it has a concept of a collection of absences, and we can specify the methods on that, and then within the domain we can call these. And then elsewhere in the infrastructure layer, we can worry about how we implement this. It might be doctrinal or own repository. We might decide that we're going to use the ODM. We might be talking to a HTTP sort of REST service using Guzzle. So the domain doesn't need to care about these things. It just has this interface. Elsewhere, we can implement that in infrastructure. And we can start to split it up like this. So the domain has the entity, it has repository interfaces, and then we have an infrastructure layer that has repository implementations, and that kind of maybe a mapping config of using Doctrine to actually map the entities through to the database. And then in the bundle, we're going to kind of use service configs to title this up and say which, so the application knows which infrastructure it's using for that domain. If you just use Doctrine repositories as well, they're just about kind of retrieval. So, but we're going to also want, if we're going to hide these things from the domain, we're going to want to hide persistence as well. So if we can add kind of an add method to that, but we just add entities to. So we've got a collection of absences. Here's a new absence, and then within the implementation, we can worry about how we actually then, get the entity manager, call persist, call flush, etc. Okay, so again, we are adding kind of an extra layer. So, effectively, we're wrapping. If we are using Doctrine, we're going to wrap the Doctrine entity and use an implementation of this interface to delegate stuff to repositories. So, again, one of the main things people say about this is like, well, cool, yeah, I can change from the Doctrine RM to ODM to Guzzle. It's like, well, how often is persistence really changed? It's like, we've been told for ages that we need to use abstraction layers for databases, but how often do I change database? And it's like, well, not that often, might happen, but this isn't the only advantage. So one of the advantages that we do get is if we just develop a domain model using those interfaces, then we can actually delay the decision about what persistence layer to use, because we can say, we can just work with those repositories and then at a later point decide, well actually the ODM makes more sense than the ORM perhaps, or now we've decided that we need to make it a REST service. And those decisions may well be informed by what you find whilst developing the domain model, rather than, whereas if we tie ourselves into the ORM right from the start then, and decide that it's different, it's going to be a lot more work to change. And it also gives us a nice thing if we do end up where we're talking to one database and another one, and also to a REST service, then it does help to hide all that kind of complexity from us. If we're going to do this, then we probably also want to avoid Doctrine's own built-in events. So if we update our absence entity, then when we need to do something else, and we might be tempted to use the on-update event that Doctrine fires automatically. But then if we're taking out actions based on that, we're really tying ourselves into the way Doctrine works. And also, it doesn't matter, this is going to get fired whenever we update the absence for whatever reason, whether it's cancellation, approval, etc. So if we move to some kind of domain event, that would be better. So we can say the absence entity instead dispatches an absence. So if the absence is cancelled, we dispatch an absence cancelled event. If it was approved, we dispatch an absence approved event. And that way we know exactly why we're reacting to the event without having to then add a load of sort of complex logic, because with the Doctrine ones, you need to first check what entity it was, then you need to find some way of finding out what actually happened, whereas we know what happened because it's in the name of the event this way. Okay, so the other sort of area that we quite often get asked about is not just what goes in the bundle, what doesn't, but what bundles should I have? How do I decide what bundles my application needs? How big should these bundles be? At what point does it grow? Do I say it's too big now, I'm going to split it? And we often see, it's like, here's the front-end bundle, here's the admin bundle, etc. But a lot of the time it's like, well, maybe just one, because if everything's concerned with the same things, and your only reason for another bundle is, well, there's loads of controllers in my directory, is, well, use subdirectories in the controllers directory. Like, don't split it into different bundles. If those controllers, the admin controllers and the sort of front-end controllers are just talking to the same things, and those bundles are sort of talking to each other a lot, then you've not really gained anything, you're just splitting the folders at a higher level. They're still very tightly coupled. So in terms of how big should they be, it could be quite big. So what we would say is try and split out code that's reusable in other applications. So this is sort of generic or technical code that's not specific to the domain. So let's say we've got custom logging requirements. For some reason we've decided not to use any of the sort of solutions that are out there, the standard solutions, but make our own way of analysing logs. And we need our application to write the logging data from one log out to that. So we need to write some kind of monologue handlers and things like this. So now these are nothing to do with human resources, so it really does make sense this time. I'm going to separate it into a custom logging bundle, possibly a library and a bundle, because then we've got stuff we can use in other non-Symfony applications. And we want to make sure there's no dependency, so there's nothing in custom logging bundles, anything to do with HR, because then we can reuse it elsewhere. If we're making more applications for the same company, we can just drop it in that bundle. So they could actually be quite small in this case. So yeah, as with many of these things, when people say how big of a bundle should be, the answer is, it depends. Okay, so when would you split application bundles? So when the domain itself is big enough to split, and it can be sensibly decoupled. So maybe in our HR thing we get to a point where, cool, we've got all this absence planning stuff, absence requests, but we also want to deal with recruitment. We want to have a way of tracking potential employees, their CVs, which interviews they've been through, the status of this, what stage are they in, what notifications do we need to give them about this and stuff like this. Keep track of who applied last year for applying again, things like this. And in this case, whilst we may still have the concept of staff members and things like this, they're really quite different from the concept of staff members in the absence planning. The things that they do are quite different. One of them, they conduct interviews, and another, they apply for leave. So even though it might be the same person underlying it, if we kind of make that one big entity and one big bundle, we're going to give them all these actions that only really apply under completely different circumstances, and we're going to end up with these complex entities that have to do lots of stuff. If we split them up here, and it makes sense, there really is a big difference between the recruitment bundle and the absence planner bundle. and we can have completely separate entities, not worry about the fact that both of them are staff members or the same staff member, and treat them almost as separate applications. And avoid then kind of going, well, actually I do need to make some changes based on something that happened in this one, so I'll just dig in and change the state of the entity. And the other one is to kind of make sure that they only talk to each other through some sort of interface, maybe REST application or using an external message queue. Because that way we avoid them being entangled because we know everything has to go through that single point. And it also then gives us the bonus of kind of future scalability, because we can just genuinely split these off into separate servers running in different servers without any real hassle. Okay, so is there anything else it makes sense to split out? And I start by saying, don't if you can, if you don't need to, but with something like this, you might find as well we need to split out user management, because if people want the same login for both, and they are the same user underneath it, we might have different entities for staff member in the context of absence planning and the same staff member in the context of recruitment planning, but they may well be the same sort of underlying user entity, which are separate things, and quite often we end up kind of making our staff members also the same the user entity that the security component needs, but the security component is very much an application concern, staff member very much the main concern. So yeah, we might want to split that up. Have a user management bundle that sits in between those, and which the others don't particularly, or which doesn't particularly know about any of the things in the absence bundle or the recruitment bundle. It just deals with the concern of validating users. And again, that might be quite small, because if we're using the FOSS user bundle or auth bundle that's out there, it might just be that this contains a little bit extra stuff that we need to add on top of those to use them within our application. But it's still worth separating it out, because otherwise, where's it going to go? Is it going to go in the absence planner bundle or recruitment bundle? It doesn't make sense for it to be in one and not the other. So if that does make sense, it's something to pull out into a separate bundle. Okay, so bundles could vary hugely in size. It's not size that's important, it's making sure that they're decoupled. So it's not splitting them on them being too big, it's splitting them on sensible lines that allow you to keep them separate. There's no point in having lots of bundles if they're not decoupled from each other. Okay, so hopefully some sort of useful things from our experience in there of like how we kind of avoid this sort of muddy situation we get into in applications and we see a lot of people quite often getting into. Now, a lot of this is just stuff that comes from the domain, quite a lot of the domain-driven design community, and it's like things that we're just starting to kind of get to grips with ourselves now. There's other people out there, even in the Symfony community, that are already writing quite a lot about this, so it's worth looking for sort of more examples and concrete kind of code examples and things. Some of these, so Will Duran's blog, Matthias Ferris, Benjamin's blog as well. So they've all probably got more experience, but definitely got more experience in this than I have. I'm just trying to learn from reading these and hoping that by sharing this we can kind of get more of a dialogue going about this within the community and stop this sort of, we don't talk about the moral part sort of thing. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Does anyone have any questions? So the question was, do I have code examples on my blog? Not yet, but I do intend to do this. I didn't want to put too many code examples in here to get bogged down in it, but I'm going to start kind of exploring it in more detail in the blog, and there's some in these, if you look at these guys' blogs as well, so I think, but yes, there will be soon.
Yeah, I have a short question. You said You would split the code in a bundle and a domain part. So you have a human resources bundle, and my question is the controller. If the controller doesn't extend the Symfony controller, I have no really dependent on the. I'm not dependent on the framework. So do I put the controller in the bundle or in my domain code?
Okay. Yeah. So yes, you might have controllers that are services. They're still essentially part of the application, so even if you've to some extent decoupled them from Symfony, it's still, the controller's not, like say, a human resources concern, it's very much a web application concern, so I would keep it in the bundle, so yeah.
If you're going to make an entity protected state itself, to make the members private or something like that, to prevent another coder to mess with a set state or set reason method?
Yeah, I would. So yeah, normally I guess quite often we can kind of generate these things. You have private properties and then public setters and getters, but yeah, I would say the idea is to try and get rid of those public setters and getters. To what extent you can, obviously somehow the data's got to get out into the view, but in terms of setting, it's like if you can completely remove straightforward setters and replace them with kind of actions, sort of methods that are in the language of the domain, so cancelling, requesting, that kind of thing, then like approval, then instead of having all those setters, because it makes them the only point of making those changes, which is how it can protect its state. If you have the public setters, then you still rely on other code not to do that. Yeah. Okay, cool. Right. Thank you guys.